Hello, my name is Dean Fenech, artist, writer, teacher, self-proclaimed cool guy. Here we're going to discuss what comics are and how comics are created. Let's start. So if we see the screen at the moment, we can see lots of clips from movies, from TV shows, from cartoons. What do they all have in common? So the one thing they have in common that they're all originated from comics. As we can see here, comics aren't just superheroes, but there are many different types of comics that we can find and read. Today, these comic characters aren't only on the page, but we can see them in movies, in TV shows, and video games, and different types of media. So comics today have excelled and jumped off the page. Also, comics, you can see them all over the internet. We have memes, online comics, and many different types of internet things that we can see. So, what are comics? So, comics as we know them began in the 1930s in America, but they have, their history stretches much more further back. In fact, before we had the written word, we had visual language, as we can see in cave art, for example. As time went on, we can see different cultures combining pictures and words. And you can see them all over many different cultures, all over many different time periods. And this is what we call sequential art. Sequential art is a number of pictures put after each other in some type of sequence to put forward a message. Usually these messages are stories. In the beginning, these stories were used to talk about their myths and legends of their particular culture. Today we can also see comics doing something similar. Also in certain types of art we can see how comic tropes today started to form. In these manuscripts you can see how the artists use words coming out of the characters' mouths, and they're very similar to today's speech bubbles, for example. So, most people today associate comics with them being young, especially in Malta. When somebody says that they used to read comics, they always tell us about the Beano or the Dandy, for example. But comics aren't only just for children. There are many different types of comics. We have comics that are adventure stories. We have comics that deal with everyday lives. We have comics dealing with serious things, such as the conflict in Palestine or the Holocaust. So comics can range every single type of storytelling. There is not just superheroes. So this is a quote that I like from Takahito Inoue, the author and artist of the manga Slam Dunk and Vagabond, for example. And he says, "We are not like painters who just have to express beauty on canvas, but we have to have a story, meaning, and also entertain." So comics isn't just writing and drawing. There's much more thought that goes into it. And this is something that we're going to discuss in this workshop today. Another quote that I really like about comics is by Scott McCloud, who is the teacher guru of understanding comics. And he says, comics are a visual medium that embraces all type of senses within them. Now, I don't agree 100%. Not every single sense can be depicted in comics, but a comic artist and writer will try to show us what cannot be shown in other mediums. For example, smell. Smell is something very difficult to show in a movie or a TV show, but in a comic you can actually show smell coming out of something. Now, comics usually aren't only made by one person. Sometimes they are. Crazy people like me like to do everything, but usually we have a group of people that work on a comic. As you can see on the screen, we have writers, we have pencilers, inkers, colorists, letterers. Many different people do different jobs on the book, and each complement each other. And if this is done correctly, you wouldn't realize when one artist starts and the other artist finishes. In fact, if you can see here, this is some examples from my book, one of my books. As you can see, we start with the script, and then I sketch out the pages, I pencil and ink the pages, and then the last step is coloring and editing and lettering. I do the coloring and lettering digitally, but that's not the only way, which we'll discuss further on. So, as you can see on the screen right now, this is the first story I wrote and drew, or the first surviving one at least. I did it when I was 3 in 1989, so do the math. And it was a story about when I was young and my cat had just died, and I wrote a story about him. I told my mom what to write, and I drew the illustrations. Today, I've worked on my own series, the first one being Apocalypse Rocked, about a group of super-powered rock stars in a post-apocalyptic future. And my latest series is Times Are Changing, about 3 Maltese figures and their journey and their descendants' journey throughout Maltese history. I've also doing a comic strip for Satar called L-Alliem l-Istudenti tal-Kulleġġ ta' San Xaħat. These are short 1 or 2 page stories that are published every month in the magazine. But I've also just drawn other people's writing, and I was also an editor for a school comic anthology at the school where I taught students to draw and write their own comics, and I edited it, we published it in 3 anthologies, and we also organized our own Comic-Con at school, where we invited other students from other schools to come and do workshops with us. I'm telling you all this because when I'm going to talk about writing, drawing, coloring, I've been on every side of this equation. I've been a writer, I've been just an artist, I've been a colorist or a letterer, I've been also an editor. So I'm going to talk about things that came from my experience and my experience studying others as well. So here we'll start with the script. A script, most people are familiar with them, especially if we're talking about acting, movies, TV shows. A script is when the writer writes down what the artist needs to draw. Now there's many different ways of one can go about this. First we have the full script. The full script is where the writer breaks down everything from the number of panels on the page, camera angles, who's in certain panels, what's in the background, movement, actions, etc. Here we have an example from Watchmen, written by Alan Moore, drawn by Dave Gibbons, and here we have an example of page 24. This is a very famous page from Watchmen, and here on the left you can see Alan Moore's script, and on the right you can see Dave Gibbons' artwork. And if we just read panel 1, we can see how Alan Moore was very detailed in his descriptions. We have, panel 1, 5 panels with 3 at the top and 2 ones beneath that. And this first one, we are looking at Rorschach through Dr. Manhattan's eyes. So that's the point of view. So that all we can see of John is one of his arms, and it goes on and explains everything in just this one panel. So this is very good because the writer will have a clear view of what he wants us to see. But at the same time, he's not giving much room to the artist to explore on his own. Sometimes writers aren't the best visual storytellers, and artists usually can contribute much more to the story, but this is how the full script goes, and this is how some writers write. Then we have the Marvel method, or the plot script. This one works a bit differently. It was developed in the 1960s by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and it came out of necessity. At the time, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were writing and drawing most of the comics coming out of Marvel at the time, and they needed a quick way to do this. So Stan and Jack would come up with a plot. Usually Stan would think of a very quick idea, and Jack Kirby would sit down and start drawing the 20-odd pages of an issue. When he would leave out spaces for dialogue, and Stan Lee would come in, sit down, and put in all his dialogue. This is good in a way because it's giving the artist much more room to develop ideas. For example, there's one famous story where Stan told Jack, "This week we want the Fantastic Four to fight a god," and Jack Kirby invented the Silver Surfer. So it gives the artist much more leeway. At the same time, the artist was just being paid as an artist, not a writer as well, even though they plotted out the 20-odd pages. And this was very infuriating for lots of artists. In fact, lots of artists left Marvel for other places, including Jack Kirby. Now, this is an example of one of my scripts and pages from Times Are Changing issue 2. I don't use either method because I'm the writer and the artist. So basically I'm writing just so I can remember what I need to draw. When I write, I know what I have in my head, so I don't need a lot of description, basically. So as you can see, my scripts look more like scripts of TV shows or a movie, for example, rather than a comic strip. So there are different ways, it's depending on who you're working with and how you like to work best. So after the script is written, it's passed on to the artists. In this case, the first artist would be the penciler. Here we have an example from Pablo Picasso, and throughout his years, how his style changed. Now, an artist working for a very long time, their artistic style tends to change. Same thing for comic artists. Here we have two examples from two manga artists, Tahoro Fujisawa of GTO fame, Great Teacher Onizuka fame, and here we see his early work, which was much more cartoony, much more manga-like, and his later work, which is much more realistic. Something very similar to Takahito Inoue. Here we have his early slam dunk work and his very recent slam dunk work, and we can see the big shift in artistic style. Now, artistic style is important, but at the same time, the art style needs to reflect the type of writing. If we can see here on the screen, let's give an example. If you have a very serious story, the artwork should be serious as well. If you write a comedy story or a kid's story, the artwork can be less realistic and more cartoony. Not always. For example, we have Mouse by Art Spiegelman. The artwork is very cartoony, but it deals with something very serious, such as the Holocaust. So here we are going to see 4 works from artist John Romita Jr. And we can see how his artwork reflects the writer that he was working with. So here we have an example from Iron Man, Demon in a Bottle. Basically, this was written in the late 1970s, so his artwork was very similar to the 1970s style of American comic book art. Next we have his Marvel work, but this time it's in 2003 with The Amazing Spider-Man. Here we can see how his style has developed and is more akin to the artwork of the early 2000s. It's much brighter, much bolder, and we can actually see John Romita Jr.'s recognizable style, especially when drawing the faces. Now we have an example of Daredevil, The Man Without Fear from 2003. Here he worked with Frank Miller. Frank Miller is known for writing dark, gritty stories, and here we see his artwork reflecting that. His pen strokes are much more sketchy, and he uses a lot of black, just like Frank Miller uses a lot of black in his work. And now we have an example from his art from Kick-Ass from 2010. Kick-Ass was something that him and Mark Millar wrote together, and we can see here it's his true style with no restrictions. Kick-Ass is a story that deals in the real world, so John Romita Jr.'s artwork is much more realistic, especially when it comes to the coloring. We can still see John Romita Jr.'s style of drawing faces, but they're much more detailed with wrinkles and lines and shading, etc. Now here we have an example from Alex Ross, and we can see the process from penciling all down to coloring, and this is something that we're going to discuss next. So the main artist of a story is the penciler, the person who draws all the artwork in pencil. He is the main artist, that is his style. After the penciler finishes his work, he passes it on to the inker. Now, famously from Kevin Smith's Mallrats, inkers are tracers, which they aren't. That's a joke made in the movie, but an inker goes over in ink what the penciler does. Now, it's not that easy, we'll explain more. We're going to see how the inker does his job well with the works of Jim Lee, the penciler, Scott Williams, the inker, and Alex Sinclair, the artist. I'm going to see how these three artists that have been working together for very many years, how they can make a full, better picture. Here on the right, we have an example of Jim Lee's pencils. Jim Lee is very sketchy in his pencils. We can see he uses a lot of lines and a lot of cross-hatching. On the left now, we have some ink work. Somebody inked over Jim Lee's pencils that I found on the internet. We can see they look similar. Let's see the real inks by Scott Williams. Now, as you can see, Scott Williams channeled Jim Lee's art. He didn't just trace what Jim Lee did, but he enhanced it. You can see the way he inks very sketchy, just like Jim Lee's pencils. And we can see where some places he didn't just fill them in with pure black, but he used the lines that Jim Lee uses. And he also adds ink effects such as splatting. And we can see lots of ink marks next to the water, for example, to give out the misty or water effects that we can see in the inkworks that isn't present in the pencils. So, as you can see here, inkers are unsung heroes of comics. Inking is clarity, it emphasizes what needs to be emphasized, adjusts what needs to be adjusted, and fixes what needs to be fixed. Now we can see Alex Sinclair's colors on top of the inks and pencils, and we can see how much more he added. We can see the blood effects on Batman's torso. We can see all the mist effects on the water. We can see how he made the background lighter so Batman and Robin can jump out more from the page. We can see how he added light effects to the legs, for example, and to the hair and to the cowl to emphasize lighting. So here we can see three artists working together to enhance one artwork. And this is how comics are usually done. Now, coloring is another beast in of itself. Usually we have somebody who does what we call flat colors. Flat colors are usually one of the assistants that just outlines the work digitally, so the actual colorist can find it, can select objects much easily on Photoshop, for example. And here we see other examples of then the colorist actually getting the flats and adding shading, lighting, and effects on top of it. And you get the end result of the artwork. There are many different types of coloring, and the coloring should reflect the outlines. If the outlines are detailed, coloring usually are detailed. If the coloring is more simplistic, if the outline is more simplistic, the coloring can be more simplistic too. There's no fast rules. Sometimes you can have detailed artwork and less detailed coloring, for example, and it still works. It depends. So here we have the same colorist, who is Matt Hollingsworth, and we can see his different techniques he used on different types of artwork. On the left we have the artwork of David Aya, and we can see how his artwork is very simplistic, bold outlines. And here we can see how the colorist used flat colors, basically. On the right we can see the work by artist Sean Murphy, and we can see how Sean Murphy's inking is more brush-like, and here the colorist used a more brush-like watercolors type of coloring. Here we have the opposite, the same artist and different colorists, and we can see how different colorists approached Jeff Loeb's art style. We have on the right, it's more a flat type of coloring, and on the left is more a flat type of coloring. On the right, it's more of a watercolor painted type of coloring, which both work. Now, color can also create mood. Here we have an example from Killing Joke. This is a very famous page from Killing Joke. So on the left, we have the original color by colorist John Higgins, and on the right, we have the recoloring by Brian Boland, who is the original penciler of this book. And we can see how they both use different type of coloring and different colors and created totally different types of mood. Here we have some more examples of this. Here we have another example from Hellboy. If we can see, the top 4 pages are all colored in dull, muted colors. There's not really much bright colors here. But if we look underneath, we do have one bright color, which is red. The bright red is used to be a contrast to all the other muted colors we see in the pages, so Hellboy can seem unearthly or out of place here in the regular world. So color can be used in very clever ways to help emphasize storytelling. Here we have examples of mostly monochrome colors, as you can see here in these examples from Black Widow, and you can see how her red-orange hair is also out of place, similar to the redness of Hellboy in the previous page. Colors sometimes have much more work to do than just coloring. Here we see an example from The Dark Knight Returns. On the left-hand side, we have the inks of Frank Miller, and on the right, we have the completed pages colored by Lynn Varley. We can see that there are certain panels that just have a figure where Lynn Varley added background. And we can also see one panel in particular where Frank Miller left it empty, and all the work is done by Lynn Varley here as the colorist. Now we're going to start to conclude, and we start the conclusion with this quote by Alan Moore. If we see comics in relation to movie, then the best they'll ever be are movies that don't move. What does this mean? Alan Moore here is emphasizing that if we are writing a comic story, the writer, the artist should use everything available to them in the medium of comics that sometimes can't be seen or used in different mediums. And we're going to see some examples here. Here we have 4 very famous pages from The Amazing Spider-Man issue 33, written by Stan Lee, drawn by original artist Steve Ditko. Here we can see Spider-Man is trapped under some machinery, water is rising. Spider-Man thinks everything is done for. He starts thinking about his family and loved ones, and these start to give him more courage. So he starts to try and push up. As Spider-Man pushes up, the space in the panels starts to grow as well. As you can see on the second page, he's stretching up, the panels also stretch with him. And then finally, on the last page, we have no panels whatsoever. Spider-Man has broken through not only in the story, but also from the comic page. He's breaking all the barriers, all the panels, and he's free. This is something that the comic page and the restrictions of comic panels has emphasized the storytelling, which can't be seen in any other mediums. Here we have a quote from Gene Yang from his TED Talk about why comics belong in the classroom. Let's read the quote. In a comic, past, present, and future all sit side by side on the same page. This means that the rate of information flow is firmly in the hands of the reader. It was like I was giving them remote control over the information. The reader, when it comes to a comic, controls the time. You can spend 1 second reading a comic panel, you can spend an hour looking over all the different details. You can go backwards, you can go forwards, something which most comic readers do. Here we have an example from the book We Three, written by Grant Morrison, and the artist is Frank Quietly. Frank here says, there are things that you can do in a comic strip that only work in a comic strip and don't work anywhere else. Here you can see one of his pages where we have the characters are going through time and passing through different planes of existence, different time frames from one panel to another. And this is something very unusual that we don't see this type of angle from a comic page. Here you can see the use of lettering from one of my favorite online comics, Cyanide and Happiness. Here we can see one of the characters says, 16 souls will break my bones, but words would never hurt me. So the character actually grabs the words that are above his head and stabs the other person next to him. Here we can see how the words are just not words, they're part of the story as well. Here we have a very famous page from The Dark Knight Returns as well. And you can see how Frank Miller used speech bubbles and sound effects. The sound effects here aren't just words placed on top of the artwork, but they are firmly part of the artwork. We can see them grow in size and shape, we can see them flow, we can see them even take the effects of the words themselves. Here the speech bubbles are the main part of the artwork and not the characters or the background. Here we have a great double spread page from Seconds by Brian Lee O'Malley. You can see that there's no one way of reading this page. You can read this page as you like, as you go around all the different rooms we can see on this page. Last example we're going to show here is from Captain Marvel by Jim Starling, and we can see that this page is meant to give us a sense of craziness, of unworldliness, of unsettlingness. And we can see how there isn't really one way of reading this, but there's many ways of reading it. So, in conclusion, comics are much more complicated than you might have thought. They give many joy to a lot of people all over the world. So go out there and create your own comics by yourselves or with your friends. Thank you for watching.